Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Brightin 16mm F2.8. This is a full-frame wide-angle prime for various mounts like Sony E mount, Nikon Z mount, Canon RF, Leica L and M mount. The price will vary according to the mount, from $249 for most of them to a little bit more expensive at $289 for the M mount. I actually reviewed it on the M mount because I recently reviewed the Techart LM-EA9 adapter, which you can see in my review here, which allows me to take M mount and actually have autofocus performance on Sony E mount. And so it was an interesting experience, and I will just note for those of you that are interested that it was a perfect lens to use on the Techart, as that autofocus worked quite well, and I didn't have to mess with the focus ring at all. I could set it at infinity, and I could just shoot away at any kind of focus distance. Now, I'll be doing my quick review here today, but if you want to stay tuned after the quick review, I will have a detailed image quality breakdown that you can see if you want more depth in terms of the optical performance. This is a compact lens that is only 78 millimeters in diameter and has a 72 millimeter front filter thread. However, it also has a fixed metal lens hood, and so there is almost no room between the filter threads and the lens hood, and I found that mounting a filter was quite difficult, so much so that I gave up because I didn't want to have an issue in removing the filter, so I would only use filters if absolutely necessary. The lens is 83 millimeters in length, but it weighs at 480 grams because it's all metal and glass construction. It does have a very nice construction with a nice anodized metal finish with a unique diamond pattern on the rings that I really liked the texture of. Those rings move smoothly, though the damping is on the heavy side. The aperture ring is declicked, so there are no preset apertures, though the traditional aperture stops are marked on the lens barrel. Inside, there are 8 straight aperture blades that produce beautiful sun stars. There are no electronics here. It is manual focus only, unless you happen to be using it as I did via the Techart. This is a lens that, however, handles very nicely, and while I didn't use it as much as a manual focus lens because of the unique situation, I think that you will be satisfied with its performance there. Now, the image quality, as noted, I'll give you a quick overview and you can stay tuned for a deeper dive into it. This is an optical formula of 12 elements in 11 groups, and those are 4 of those elements are more exotic ones, including 2 low dispersion and 2 high diffraction elements. The MTF chart, as you can see, looks quite good with the exception of the corners. I did find some optical flaws, however, that the distortion, while it's not very high, much lower than the Canon 16mm F2.8 SDM that I recently reviewed. So there's a minimal amount of distortion here, but it is fairly complex with a mustache pattern, and so for manually correcting it, it corrects imperfectly, and so it is disadvantaged versus the Canon in that regard, in that the Canon has the advantage of having first-party lens profile corrections. There's also some heavy vignette at f2.8 that does improve as you stop down, but doesn't go away altogether. There is very little longitudinal chromatic aberration before or after the plane of focus, but there is some lateral chromatic aberration near the edge of the frame, though fortunately that is fairly easily to correct with just one click in software. I found that the wide open sharpness and contrast with my 50 megapixel test body at 200% magnification, which is the way I do my test, it was only okay, with the corners dropping off hard. Stopping down to f4 gave good improvement, save for the far corners. And by f5.6, image quality across the frame is looking very good, with a peak at f8 where it is excellent all across the frame. Real-world images are sharp and crisp with nice detail at these smaller apertures. The minimum aperture is f22, though diffraction, as it always does, plays some havoc on the lens quality, making image quality much softer than even f2.8, save for the far corners where image quality was not very good at f2.8. The lens can only focus as closely as 30 centimeters, but I did find that the minimum focus distance performance was quite good, with good detail and contrast, and really not bad of bokeh quality for a wide-angle lens. As you can see here, the flare resistance is somewhat of a mixed bag. The sunbursts look awesome, and in some places flare is not bad, but there are certain points in the frame where you will see some strong ghosting and veiling artifacts, and so it is an imperfect performance. In conclusion, however, if you stop the lens down, you can get some really excellent images out of it with good color, good detail, good contrast. And I also found that for close-up images where corners don't matter, I also liked a lot of the f2.8 images that I took. For a price point of only around $250 US, this lens is reasonably high performing. And of course, it is going to be rare to find this wide a focal length with this large of a maximum aperture at this low of a price. So I do think that there is a market for the Brightin Star 16mm f2.8. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my text review and image gallery, and also some buying links if you would like to check things out further. And of course, stay tuned if you would like a much more detailed breakdown of the image quality. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in. So first of all, this is what 105 degrees of field of view looks, just looking down towards my feet. Moving on to some actual tests, here's a look at what you're going to get in terms of vignette and distortion. So you can definitely see there is some of both here. We'll parse this out. Now, this being a third-party lens without electronics, you're going to have to look up a correction profile and probably manually load it into software if you so desire. You can see that manually correcting it is not particularly easy due to there being some mustache pattern type distortion there. I used only a -3 to correct for the distortion. You can see I got fairly straight lines there on the side, but unfortunately because it's not linear, there's that wave pattern, and so it doesn't correct equally. And as far as the vignette goes, I maxed out the slider up to 100, and you can see I moved the midpoint almost all the way over. Unfortunately, as I see with some lenses, the vignette has almost a little bit of a color cast to it, as you can see, kind of a cyan color there in the corner. It's going to show up obviously more on something like this, but if you are shooting in a scene with snow, for example, you may also see it there. Now, in terms of the sheer quantity of distortion, we are nowhere near what I saw recently with the new Canon RF 16mm f2.8. And you can see that that has so much barrel distortion that, Canon actually left it. This was framed tight in my viewfinder, but Canon leaves it this wide on the raw image to allow for some massive amount of correction. And so as far as the quantity of distortion, I mean, the Brightin Star lens is way, way better. But difference being is that the Canon is going to get good profile support, whereas the Brightin Star does not. So if you point that at a brick wall, you are going to see just that wave pattern that I just showed you there. And so it certainly will show up when you've got straight lines like this, where you can see some of that just overall wavy pattern, even though there's not a lot of actual distortion there. It's the nature of the distortion that's problematic. Now, somewhat ironically, in my real-world images, I really didn't notice it very much, or really at all. And so here we can see, now in this case, the horizon line is fairly close to the center, and so it's not emphasized, but we can see I do have some straight lines running across here near the front of this image, and we can actually see that it didn't really show up or cause any kind of problem. So I'm actually kind of surprised somewhat in how much distortion I see in my chart test, and it makes me think that maybe it is exaggerated at that close of a focus distance, and it is less severe when you're shooting at more distant focus distances. So let's talk about resolution for a moment. Now, I'm obviously doing a bit of a torture test. This is a 50 megapixel sensor. I'm showing it at 200%, as I always do. And so obviously that's not going to be very kind to much of anything, but particularly to a budget lens like this. What we can see is that there is a decent amount of resolution in the center of the frame, even wide open. Contrast is not exceptional. Stopping down to f4 is going to help. Mid-frame is not really far behind, and you can see definitely an increase in performance by the time we get to f4. Down here in the corner, we can see that left side is soft but not terrible. As we get towards that last degree, right towards the edge, it really falls off a cliff. And likewise at f4, left side is looking quite good. The very extreme corner is looking quite poor still. Now, for a bit of perspective, again, the Canon frame's unusually wide to make up for the distortion, and so it's not a complete apples-to-apples comparison. It's also slightly lower resolution at 45 megapixels, but you can see that the contrast is much higher, as well as sharpness on the Canon in the center of the frame, likewise in the mid-frame, and down here in the corner, it is better, though not extremely better. So if we step both the lenses down to f4, we can see that now the gap is not quite as wide. The Canon is still better, but in the center of the frame, but the Brightin star is looking better as we saw previously. Mid-frame, there's a little advantage for Canon, but it's not significant. And we can also see down here in the corners that the gap is closed in somewhat, other than that last little degree where the Canon is better. It's when we stop the Brightin star down to f5.6 that it really starts to get quite exceptional. And so you can see the contrast has now increased to where it's looking quite sharp there. It really shows up to me here in the mid frame, which at f5.6 is looking really excellent. And we can also see now that compared to f4 that the corner is starting to look quite good, and that sharpness profile is creeping out further and further towards the edge of the frame. By f8, we can see that it's now very sharp right there into the corner, and if we pop back and look at the mid frame, it's looking fabulous. We'll take a look at a few other spots. Sir Winston looking very sharp, and looking up here, we can see great resolution here in the Filipino bill there, and so everything is just looking really, really fantastic by f8. Our minimum aperture is f22, but you can see that diffraction has really started to soften things up, and even relative to f2.8, f22 is looking quite soft by comparison due to that contrast. And one exception being that in the corners, still at f22, that improved resolution helps things to look better, even with diffraction being at play. Now, minimum focus distance is 30 centimeters, and I was actually here at 100% magnification. I thought that up-close performance is really actually quite excellent. You can see it looks really crisp. It actually looks better than what it did looking at it on kind of the main level, and we can see that that's good up until we can see that sharpness starts to fall apart right there in the very corner. So as a byproduct of that, up-close performance is actually quite good. And so you can see here, as I take a look at the coils of rope here, there's a pretty good contrast, again, not off the charts, but looking pretty good. And really the quality of the background blur here is not too bad. We can see there's minimal amount of fringing that is showing up there, but nothing looking too bad. And, I'm able to get quite close and to get a decent amount of magnification, and you can see here that the detail is really quite good, and thus in this kind of scene, kind of an optimal scene, there's a little bit of busyness in this area, but I'm able to get a fairly blurred out looking forest background here with an autumn leaf. You can see again looking really, really crisp, and a nice diffused background, and then even a little bit further out where the background's not as blurred out, but the detail is looking really good on the plane of focus, and then the blur of the background, again, not looking too bad. There's more outlining than what I would like of the bokeh circles, but frankly, I've seen a whole lot worse than this. Likewise, with real-world sharpness at 100% magnification, less of a torture test, and maybe more at an optimized distance, I really felt like the detail looked quite good here. So this is probably around f5.6, and we can see that everything looks good. A little bit of drop-off in the extreme corner, but by and large, throughout the image, the detail is looking really quite nice. Another shot here, we can see that, the colors and contrast are fairly intense here, and not maybe 100% as sophisticated as say like a Sony GM lens, but looking quite good really overall. Lots of punch to it. We've looked at this image already, but we'll just take a look here at close focus distance. Again, very nice detail, and overall a great looking image. Had an opportunity to shoot in the Barren River Canyon in Algonquin Provincial Park, and you can see here that as we look into this very large scene, so we've got kayakers and canoers down in the river below, you can see that there's great detail there, and a lot going on in this scene, and yet it's rendered very nicely here at just shooting at in a different perspective. And we can see here again not only that the detail looks nice, but for a landscape type image, I'm not really having an issue with either the vignette or the distortion, neither of which I have corrected here. And so, overall, for landscape purposes, a great looking image. Now here is the absolute worst that I saw as far as flare resistance. And so we can see that there are a variety of different flare patterns as I kind of walk with it. We can also see, however, that 8-bladed sunburst from those 8 straight aperture blades looks really awesome. And it really adds a lot to the image. And so if it's used wisely, like in this image here, we got all the benefit of the sunburst, and we get next to no effect from flare. So no, major problem there. Also in this image here, there's a tiny little ghosting artifact, but the sunburst itself looks great, as does the image as a whole. That just looks, really, really nice. Nice color there. Another example here, again, tiny ghosting pattern, but huge sunburst effect that, looks really exceptionally nice. And so I think a lot of strengths lie there. So finally, how about using this lens for astrophotography? At f2.8, as we can see here, and zooming in, we can see that we have been able to pick up a nice amount of star points in the center of the frame. Everything looks nice and crisp, and there really isn't any kind of like chromatic aberrations that are destroying the look of the stars. Now, off towards the very edge of the frame, I do see a little bit of chromatic distortion. You can see just some smearing, a little bit of like wings type effect. Looking over here on the other side, you can see a little bit of that, but I think we can agree that neither is it really terrible in terms of that performance either. And so certainly another application for this, maybe a very strong one, is for astrophotography if you're looking for a decent but inexpensive astrophotography lens. So all in all, there are some optical weaknesses, but as we've seen in this examination, also some significant optical strengths.